Sergeant Marcus Hayes was 2 miles deep into the Kentucky wilderness when he found men who were supposed to be dead. They were hiding in a church with boarded windows, eating from U.S. Army ration tins, wearing uniforms without insignia. They were American soldiers, white men, declared killed in action in France 6 months earlier. They looked at Hayes and his squad with eyes that held no shame, only cold calculation. One of them, a man with sergeant stripes faded but still visible, stepped forward and said quietly, "You didn't see us here." Hayes felt his rifle suddenly heavier in his hands. He had a choice to make, and both answers would destroy something. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. February 1945. The Appalachian forest stretched endlessly in every direction, bare branches clawing at a sky the color of old steel. Sergeant Marcus Hayes moved through the underbrush, with his squad spread in a loose tactical formation, boots crunching over frozen leaves. The cold bit through their wool coats, settling into bones already tired from 3 days of field exercises. They were 12 men, all from the 92nd Infantry Division, conducting navigation and reconnaissance drills in terrain that felt more hostile than anything they'd trained for overseas. Hayes raised his fist. The squad stopped. He scanned the tree line ahead, listening. Nothing but wind through empty branches and the distant call of a crow. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. Corporal James Booker moved up beside him, rifle at low ready, eyes sharp. Booker was 22 from Chicago, quick with a joke but deadly serious when it mattered. "Anything, Sarge?" Booker asked quietly. Hayes shook his head. "Just checking the map. We're supposed to hit the rally point by 1400 hours. Should be another mile northwest." Behind them, the rest of the squad waited in silence. Private Lewis, Private Washington, Private Carter. Young men mostly, some barely 19, all of them shaped by training that had been twice as hard as what white units endured. They'd learned early that mistakes weren't tolerated, that every action reflected not just on them, but on every soldier who looked like them. So they moved carefully, spoke precisely, followed orders without question. Hayes folded the map and signaled forward. The squad moved again, weaving between pines and bare oaks, stepping over fallen logs slick with frost. The terrain was rough, unforgiving, perfect for teaching soldiers how to navigate when nothing looked familiar and the enemy could be anywhere. Except there was no enemy here, just cold trees and the weight of rifles that never left their shoulders. 20 minutes later, Private Lewis called out softly from the right flank, "Sarge, I got something." Hayes moved toward him, keeping low. Lewis was crouched behind a rotted stump, pointing through the trees. Hayes followed his line of sight and saw it. A structure, wooden, weathered, partially hidden by undergrowth and young pines that had grown up around it. A building that didn't belong in the middle of nowhere. "What is that?" Booker whispered, coming up beside them. Hayes studied it through the gaps in the trees. It was small, rectangular, with a pitched roof sagging in the middle. The wood was gray with age, the windows covered from the inside with something dark. No smoke from a chimney, no movement. But there was a door, and the door looked like it had been used recently. The snow around the base was disturbed, packed down by boots. "Looks like an old church," Hayes said quietly. His instincts prickled. "Out here? Miles from any town?" "Maybe abandoned," Lewis offered. "Maybe," Hayes replied. "But someone's been here." He signaled the squad to spread out, forming a perimeter around the structure. They moved silently, weapons ready, eyes scanning for threats. Hayes felt his heart rate increase slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden shift in purpose. This wasn't part of the exercise, this was real. When they were in position, Hayes motioned Booker and Washington forward. The three of them approached the church slowly, boots careful on the frozen ground. Up close, Hayes could see details that confirmed his suspicion. Fresh boot prints in the mud near the door, a stack of firewood recently cut leaning against the side wall, and a smell, faint but unmistakable. Wood smoke, food, people. Hayes raised his rifle slightly, finger near the trigger guard. He glanced at Booker, who nodded. Washington moved to the side, covering the corner. Hayes reached the door and paused, listening. Voices. Low murmurs from inside. too quiet to make out words but definitely human. He knocked. 3 solid strikes with his fist. The voices inside stopped instantly. Silence. Hayes knocked again. U.S. Army. Open the door. Nothing. Then footsteps, slow and deliberate. The sound of something heavy being moved. A bar lifting. The door cracked open 3 inches and a face appeared in the gap. White, male, mid-30s, stubbled jaw, eyes that assessed Hayes with a sharpness that made his jaw tighten. "Help you?" the man asked. His voice was flat, giving nothing away. Hayes kept his rifle steady. "This is U.S. Army property. Who are you and what are you doing here?" The man's eyes flicked to Booker, then Washington, then back to Hayes. "Didn't know this was Army land. We're just passing through." "In the middle of a restricted training zone," Hayes said evenly. "Step outside." The man hesitated. Then he pushed the door open wider and stepped into the cold air. He wore an olive drab shirt, wool trousers, and boots that looked military issue. No insignia, no patches, but the way he carried himself, the way his eyes scanned the perimeter, the way his hands stayed visible but ready. This was a soldier. "You got identification?" Hayes asked. "Lost my wallet couple weeks back." "Name?" "Thomas Riker." Hayes studied him. "Where are you coming from, Mr. Riker?" "Down south. Looking for work up in the coal towns." "On foot? In February?" Riker shrugged. "Times are hard." Hayes didn't believe a word of it. He glanced past Riker into the shadowed interior of the church. "How many people you got in there?" "Just a few of us. Friends." "Step aside," Hayes said. "I need to see inside." Riker's jaw tightened. "That's not necessary. We're not causing trouble." "This is a military zone," Hayes repeated. "Step aside." For a long moment, Riker didn't move. Then he exhaled slowly and stepped to the side. Hayes motioned Booker and Washington forward, and the 3 of them entered the church. The interior was dim, lit only by thin cracks of daylight around the boarded windows. The air smelled of wood smoke, sweat, and canned meat. As Hayes' eyes adjusted, he saw them. Men. Sitting on pews, standing near a cold stove, leaning against the walls. 12 of them, all white, all wearing pieces of U.S. Army uniforms, though stripped of rank and unit patches. They stared at Hayes and his men with expressions that ranged from wary to hostile. Hayes felt ice slide down his spine. These weren't civilians. These were soldiers. And something about this was very, very wrong. "Everyone on your feet," Hayes said, his voice carrying authority. "Hands where I can see them." The men stood slowly, some with hands already raised, others moving reluctantly. Hayes counted again. 12. Same as his squad outside. He scanned their faces, their postures, the way they held themselves. Combat veterans, no question. Booker moved along the side wall, keeping his rifle ready. Washington stayed near the door, watching. Hayes stepped deeper into the room, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Near the back he saw supplies, stacks of C-ration boxes, blankets, a pile of canvas bags marked with quartermaster stamps. "Where did you get those?" Hayes asked, pointing to the rations. "Found them," Riker said from the doorway. "Found them?" Hayes turned back to face the men. "You all got names?" They exchanged glances. A few nodded. One man, taller than the rest with a scar across his left eyebrow, stepped forward. "I'm Sergeant William Harding. These are my men." Hayes's pulse kicked up. "Sergeant." That confirmed it. "You got orders to be here." Harding's face was stone. "We're on leave." "Leave?" Hayes let the word hang in the air. In a church, in the middle of a restricted zone, with stolen supplies. "Not stolen," Harding said quietly. "Acquired." Hayes stared at him. Something here was deeply wrong, and every instinct screamed at him to get his men out and report this immediately. But he needed to understand what he was looking at. He needed proof. "Booker," Hayes said without turning. "Check those bags." Booker moved to the back of the church and crouched beside the canvas bags. He opened one, rummaged inside, and pulled out a metal identification tag on a chain. He stared at it, his face changing. "Sarge," he said softly, "you need to see this." Hayes crossed the room, keeping Harding and his men in his peripheral vision. He took the dog tag from Booker and read the name stamped into the metal. PFC Andrew Kellerman, serial number, blood type. And below that, the words that made Hayes's blood run cold. This tag was supposed to be on a dead man. He looked up at Harding. Kellerman was killed in France. December 3rd. Battle of the Bulge. Harding said nothing. Hayes pulled another tag from the bag. Corporal James Denton, KIA December 7th. He pulled a third. Private Eugene Ross, KIA November 20th. All of them, all dead. Officially. Hayes turned slowly to face the men standing in the church. They stared back at him, silent, unmoving, and he understood. These men weren't on leave, they weren't lost. They were deserters. They had faked their deaths and disappeared into the American wilderness, hiding while the war raged overseas, waiting for it all to be over. Harding stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "You didn't see us here, Sergeant." Hayes felt the weight of his rifle, the cold air in his lungs, the eyes of his own men watching from behind him. Outside, the rest of his squad waited, unaware of what he'd just uncovered. Dead men, living, hiding. And now he had to decide what to do about it, because if he reported this, these men would hang. Desertion in wartime carried only one sentence, but if he didn't report it, he'd be complicit. He'd be protecting men who'd abandoned their brothers, who'd let others die in their place, who'd chosen survival over duty. Hayes looked at the dog tags in his hand, at the names of ghosts, and realized that whatever choice he made would haunt him for the rest of his life. Outside, a crow called through the frozen trees, and the wind carried the sound away into silence. The silence inside the church stretched tight as wire. Hayes held the dog tags in his fist, the metal cold against his palm. 12 men stared at him from across the room, their faces carved from stone. Behind him, Booker and Washington had gone still, rifles raised but fingers off triggers, waiting for orders that Hayes didn't know how to give. Harding took a slow step forward, hands visible, movements careful. His voice came quiet and measured. "Like I said, Sergeant, you didn't see us here." Hayes looked at him, at the scar across his eyebrow, at the faded sergeant stripes on his sleeve, at eyes that had seen combat and made a choice to walk away from it. "Step back," Hayes said. Harding stopped, but he didn't step back. Behind Hayes, the door creaked. Corporal Booker shifted his weight, and Hayes heard the subtle click of a safety being released. The tension ratcheted higher. Hayes raised one hand slightly, a signal to hold. "Nobody moves," Hayes said, loud enough for everyone to hear. His mind raced through options, none of them good. He could order his men to take these deserters into custody, but 12 against 3 in a confined space, and his squad outside wouldn't know what was happening until shots were fired. Or he could walk away, pretend he'd never been here, and carry this secret until it rotted him from the inside. He chose neither. Instead, he asked a question. "How?" Harding's jaw tightened. "You don't need to know that. I need to know everything," Hayes said. His voice carried the weight of authority he'd earned through 5 years of service, through training that had broken men twice his size, through proving himself every single day because the color of his skin meant he had to. "You're dead men. I'm holding your tags. So you tell me how 12 soldiers faked their deaths in the middle of the biggest battle in Europe, or I walk outside and call my commanding officer right now." For a long moment, Harding said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly and nodded toward one of the pews. "Sit. This is going to take a minute." Hayes didn't sit, neither did Booker or Washington, but Hayes lowered his rifle slightly, just enough to show he was willing to listen. "Talk." Harding glanced at his men, then back to Hayes. "We were 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Division. Got hit hard in the Hurtgen Forest back in November, lost half our company in 3 days. They pulled us back, patched us up, sent us right back in. Then came December. The Germans broke through the Ardennes, caught everyone by surprise. We got thrown into the line near Bastogne." Hayes knew the story. Everyone did. The Battle of the Bulge. The Germans' last desperate push. Thousands dead. Entire units encircled and destroyed in the snow. Harding continued. "My platoon got cut off 2nd day. No radio contact, no supplies. Temperature dropped to 10 below. We were in a farmhouse outside some village I can't even pronounce. 23 of us. Then the Germans hit us with artillery. Direct hit on the building. Roof came down. Walls collapsed. When the dust settled, 11 men were dead. crushed, burned, unrecognizable. He paused, his eyes distant. We buried them in the basement, tagged them with our names, switched uniforms with the bodies. Then we disappeared into the forest before anyone could regroup and count survivors. Booker made a sound behind Hayes, something between disgust and disbelief. You left your own men in your uniforms. They were already dead, Harding said flatly. We just gave them names. Hayes felt something cold settle in his chest. You left your unit in the middle of a battle. There was no unit left, Harding snapped. Everyone else was dead or scattered. The line was breaking everywhere. We were ordered to hold a position we couldn't hold with ammunition we didn't have against an enemy we couldn't stop. So we made a choice. You chose to run, Hayes said quietly. We chose to live, Harding shot back. You weren't there. You don't know what it was like. The words hung between them like an accusation. Hayes had trained for combat. His entire division had. But they'd been kept stateside while white units shipped overseas. The 92nd had seen action in Italy, but Hayes's battalion remained in the States, running drills and exercises while the real war happened an ocean away. Part of him understood what Harding was saying. Another part recoiled from it with every fiber of his being. So you've been hiding here since December, Hayes said. 3 months. We moved around at first. One of the other men spoke up. Younger, maybe 25, with a Tennessee accent. Stayed in abandoned barns, hunting cabins. Found this church 2 weeks ago. Figured we could wait it out until the war ends. And then what? Booker asked. You just walk back into society like nothing happened. We'll figure that out when it comes, the man said. Hayes studied them. 12 faces, some defiant, some ashamed. All of them alive while other men wore their names on casualty lists. Families had received telegrams. Mothers had wept. Graves had been dug with the wrong bodies inside. You know what happens if this gets reported, Hayes said. Harding nodded. Court-martial. Execution. We know. And you think I'm going to let you just disappear back into the woods? I think, Harding said carefully, that you're in a difficult position. You report us, we hang. That's army justice. But you're a smart man, Sergeant. You know how this looks. 12 white soldiers hiding in a church, discovered by an all-Negro squad. You bring us in, people are going to ask questions. They're going to wonder if you handled it right, if your men followed procedure, if maybe you had some other reason for bringing us in. Hayes felt anger flash hot in his chest. You threatening me? I'm stating facts, Harding said. You and I both know how the army works. We know who gets believed and who gets questioned. You turn us in, your career is done. Best case scenario, you end up pushing papers at some supply depot for the rest of your service. Worst case, they find a way to blame you for not securing us properly, and you end up in front of a board of inquiry. The man was right, and Hayes hated him for it. The army had rules, but it also had realities. A Negro sergeant bringing in 12 white deserters would generate attention nobody wanted. Questions would be asked, procedures would be examined, and Hayes would be under a microscope while these men were tried and hanged. Washington spoke up from the doorway, his voice tight. Sarge, we should get the rest of the squad. Hayes held up a hand. Wait. He looked back at Harding. You had this speech ready. Had it ready since the day we left, Harding admitted. Figured if we ever got caught, we'd need leverage. Turns out, we got lucky. You're exactly the kind of man who'd understand the cost of doing the right thing. Don't, Hayes said, his voice hard. Don't pretend you know me. Don't pretend this is about anything other than you trying to save your own skin. You're right, Harding said. That's exactly what this is. Same as what it was in France. Same as what it'll be tomorrow if you let us walk out of here. I'm trying to survive, but here's the thing, Sergeant. So are you. And right now, we both know that turning us in destroys us both. Hayes wanted to deny it. Wanted to say that duty mattered more than consequences, that honor meant doing what was right regardless of cost. But he'd spent 5 years in an army that preached equality while practicing segregation. He'd watched men like him work twice as hard for half the recognition. He'd stood at attention while officers who couldn't lead a patrol to a latrine lectured him on military bearing. He knew the system. He knew how it protected some and crushed others. And he knew that Harding was right. If he reported this, these men would hang. But his career would end. His reputation would be questioned. and the truth of what happened here would be buried under layers of procedure and politics until nobody remembered that he'd done his duty. But if he walked away, 12 deserters would go free. 12 men who'd abandoned their brothers, who'd let others die in their place, who'd chosen survival over honor. And Hayes would have to live with knowing he'd let them. The dog tags felt impossibly heavy in his hand. Booker moved up beside him, close enough that his voice wouldn't carry. "Sarge, what are we doing here?" Hayes looked at him, at Washington standing by the door, at the men sitting in the pews, watching, waiting, at Harding with his cold calculation and his perfectly reasoned trap. "Give me a minute," Hayes said quietly. He walked to the back of the church, to the boarded window where thin cracks of daylight cut through the darkness. Outside, his squad waited. 10 men who trusted him to make the right call. Men who'd followed him through every drill, every exercise, every impossible standard the army set for them. Men who believed in him because he'd never given them reason not to. And now he had to choose. Report these deserters and watch everything fall apart, or keep their secret and become complicit in their crime. Behind him, someone coughed. Footsteps creaked on old wood. The wind outside pushed against the church walls, making them groan. Hayes closed his eyes and thought about duty, about honor, about the weight of a choice that had no good answer. Then he opened his eyes, turned around, and made his decision. Hayes turned from the window and looked at Harding. His voice came out steady, cold. "Here's what's going to happen. You and your men are going to pack up everything. Rations, blankets, everything you took. You're going to carry it outside and load it onto whatever vehicle brought it here." Harding's expression didn't change. "We didn't bring a vehicle. Then you're going to carry it," Hayes said. "Every box, every can. You're going to erase every trace that you were here, and then you're going to walk north until you're out of this forest." Harding studied him. "And after that, I don't care where you go. But if I ever hear your names again, if any of you ever surface anywhere near military personnel, if you ever try to come back from the dead, I will personally hunt you down and drag you to the nearest MP station. You understand me?" The church was silent. The deserters exchanged glances. One of them, the young man with the Tennessee accent, spoke up. "You're letting us go?" "I'm not letting you do anything," Hayes said. "I'm giving you one chance to disappear for real. You take it, or I walk outside and make a call that ends all of you by sunrise." Booker shifted beside Hayes, his voice low and urgent. "Sarge, we can't just—" "We can," Hayes cut him off, "and we will." He looked at Harding again. "You've got 30 minutes. Move." The deserters stood slowly, still uncertain if this was real or a trap. Harding watched Hayes for a long moment, then nodded. "All right." He gestured to his men. "You heard him. Pack it up." They moved quickly, gathering supplies, rolling blankets, stacking ration boxes. Hayes, Booker, and Washington stood near the door, watching. Outside, the rest of the squad waited, unaware of what was unfolding inside. Hayes could hear their voices faintly, joking about the cold, wondering what was taking so long. Booker leaned close to Hayes. "You sure about this?" "No," Hayes said quietly, "but I'm sure about what happens if we bring them in." Washington spoke from the other side. "What do we tell the squad?" Hayes had already thought about that. "We tell them we found an abandoned church, looked inside. Nothing but old furniture and some boot prints, probably hunters or drifters. We log it and move on." "They're going to ask questions," Booker said. "Let them ask," Hayes replied. "We stick to the story." The deserters worked in silence, efficient and practiced. They'd clearly done this before, breaking down a camp and erasing their presence. Within 20 minutes, the church looked abandoned again. The rations were packed into canvas bags, the blankets rolled tight, the stove cold and clean. One of them even swept the floor with a bundle of pine branches, erasing footprints. Harding hoisted a bag onto his shoulder and walked over to Hayes. "We appreciate this." "Don't," Hayes said. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because the alternative destroys more than just you." Harding nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, we didn't want to leave our brothers behind. We just couldn't see dying for nothing. Every soldier who dies thinks it's for nothing," Hayes said. "The only difference is most of them don't get to run." Harding held his gaze for a moment, then turned and walked toward the door. His men filed out behind him, moving quickly and quietly into the forest. Hayes watched them disappear between the trees, carrying their stolen supplies and their fake deaths with them. When the last one was gone, Booker exhaled slowly. "What did we just do, Sarge?" "Our jobs," Hayes said. He picked up the dog tags from where he'd set them on a pew, looked at the names stamped into the metal, then slipped them into his pocket. Evidence he'd keep just in case. "Let's move out." They stepped outside into the cold. The rest of the squad was spread in a loose perimeter, rifles ready, watching the tree line. Private Lewis saw Hayes and straightened. "What was in there, Sarge?" "Old church," Hayes said. "Abandoned. Looks like drifters or hunters used it recently, but nobody's home now." He gestured to the north. "We're moving to the rally point. Form up." The squad fell into formation without question. They trusted Hayes. Always had. As they moved through the forest, Hayes felt the weight of that trust pressing down harder than his rifle. He'd lied to them. Not about the church being abandoned, but about what it meant. He'd let deserters go free, and none of his men would ever know. The march back to the rally point took 2 hours. The cold deepened as afternoon shadows stretched across the snow. Nobody spoke much. Training had taught them to conserve energy, to move efficiently, to stay alert. Hayes walked at the front, his mind churning through what had just happened and what it meant. He'd made a choice. Not the right one, not the honorable one, but the only one that didn't destroy everything he'd built. And now he had to live with it. They reached the rally point at 14:30 hours. Lieutenant Morrison was waiting with the other training squads, checking off names on a clipboard. He looked up as Hayes approached. "You're late, Sergeant." "Terrain was rougher than expected, sir," Hayes reported. "We maintained pace, but the route took longer." Morrison nodded, making a note. "Anything unusual?" Hayes hesitated for half a second. "Found an old church about 2 miles northwest. Looked abandoned. Might have been used by hunters recently." "Mark it on the map," Morrison said. "We'll have the MPs check it out later." He looked past Hayes at the squad. "Everyone accounted for?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Get your men fed and debriefed. We move out at 600 tomorrow." Hayes saluted and moved back to his squad. They broke down their gear, cleaned their weapons, prepared rations. The routine was familiar, comforting, but Hayes couldn't stop seeing those dog tags, couldn't stop hearing Harding's voice. "You're exactly the kind of man who'd understand the cost of doing the right thing." That night, the squads gathered around field stoves, eating sea rations and swapping stories. Someone told a joke about a sergeant and a general. Laughter rippled through the group. Hayes sat apart, staring into the small fire, turning a tin cup of coffee between his hands. Booker sat down beside him. "You okay, Sarge?" Hayes nodded. "Fine. You sure?" "Because what happened today is done," Hayes interrupted. "It's done and we don't talk about it again, understand?" Booker was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I trust you, Sarge. Whatever you decided back there, I know you had a reason." Hayes looked at him. "Sometimes there's no good reason. Sometimes there's just the reason that costs the least." Booker didn't respond to that. He just sat there shoulder to shoulder with Hayes, staring into the fire while the cold settled around them, and the forest held its secrets. The next morning, the squads packed up and marched back to base. The exercise was declared a success. Lieutenant Morrison filed his reports. The abandoned church was logged as a potential shelter for civilians or drifters, nothing worth investigating further, and 12 dead men stayed dead in the official records, while 12 living men walked free somewhere in the wilderness. Hayes returned to his duties. Training continued. Orders came down. The war in Europe was entering its final months. Germany was collapsing. Victory was inevitable now, just a matter of time. And through it all, Hayes carried the weight of his choice like a stone in his chest. 3 weeks later, he was in the battalion headquarters filing paperwork when he overheard 2 officers talking near the coffee station. One of them, a captain Hayes didn't recognize, was reading from a telegram. "Another one," the captain said, shaking his head. "Damnedest thing. Family got notification their son was killed in France back in December. Body shipped home, full military funeral. Now they're saying it wasn't him. Dental records don't match. They buried somebody else." The other officer, a major, frowned. "How does that happen?" "Confusion in the field," the captain said. "Bodies get mixed up during heavy fighting. It's rare, but it happens. They're opening an investigation. Hayes' hand tightened on the pen he was holding. He forced himself to keep writing, to stay focused on the form in front of him. But inside, his mind was racing. They were finding the bodies, checking records, discovering the switches. It was only a matter of time before someone started asking harder questions. That night he lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He'd thought letting those men go would end it. But it wouldn't end. It would keep unfolding, keep spreading, keep revealing itself piece by piece until someone figured out what had really happened. And when they did, the questions would come. Who knew? Who helped them? Who let them disappear? Hayes closed his eyes and saw Harding's face, saw the dog tags, saw the choice he'd made, and the consequences he couldn't control. Outside, wind rattled the barracks windows. Somewhere in the darkness, 12 men were still walking, and Hayes wondered if they understood that the hardest part wasn't running from the war. It was living with what they'd done to survive it. But Hayes was about to learn that his decision in that church had set something in motion he couldn't stop, because 2 days later, a telegram arrived at the base, and the name on it was one Hayes recognized from the dog tags in his pocket. Someone was asking questions, and the answers were going to lead straight back to that forest. The telegram sat on Lieutenant Morrison's desk like a bomb waiting to detonate. Hayes stood at attention, his face neutral, while Morrison read it for the 3rd time. The lieutenant's jaw worked silently before he finally looked up. "This came through official channels," Morrison said. "Family in Ohio says their son's body was returned from France. Full military honors, buried in the family plot. Then the War Department contacted them 2 days ago. Dental records don't match. The man in that grave isn't their son." Hayes kept his breathing steady. "What's the name, sir?" "Corporal James Denton." He looked at Hayes. "Your squad conducted exercises in the forest 3 weeks ago. You reported finding an abandoned church." "Yes, sir." Morrison tapped the telegram. "Denton was officially killed near Bastogne, same area where 11 other men from his unit were also declared KIA, all buried, all being exhumed now for identification." He leaned back in his chair. "You see where this is going, Sergeant?" Hayes did. He saw it clearly. 12 bodies, 12 names, all wrong. And when they finished checking, they'd find 12 empty graves and 12 missing soldiers. And someone would remember that a squad had found a church in the Kentucky wilderness right around the time those men would have made it back stateside. "I see it, sir," Hayes said. Morrison studied him for a long moment. "That church, you sure it was empty?" Hayes met his eyes. "Yes, sir. Just old furniture and boot prints. Nobody home." The lieutenant's gaze didn't waver, because if you found something else in there, something you didn't report, now would be the time to say so. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Hayes could feel the weight of the dog tags in his footlocker back in the barracks, hidden under his spare uniforms. Physical evidence, proof, a noose waiting to tighten. "There was nothing else, sir," Hayes said. Morrison held his gaze for another few seconds, then nodded slowly. "All right, but the CID is opening an investigation, Criminal Investigation Division. They'll be here next week to interview everyone who was in that area. You make sure your squad has their stories straight." "Yes, sir." Dismissed. Hayes saluted and left the office. Outside, the spring sun was breaking through the morning clouds, warming the air. But Hayes felt cold all the way through. CID. Military police trained to find lies, trained to break stories apart until the truth bled through. They'd interview his entire squad separately, compare statements, look for inconsistencies, and Booker and Washington knew what they'd seen in that church. He found Booker in the motor pool working on a Jeep engine. When Hayes approached, Booker straightened and wiped his hands on a rag. His face told Hayes he'd already heard. "CID's coming," Booker said quietly. Hayes nodded. "Next week." Booker glanced around to make sure they were alone. "What are we going to tell them?" "The same thing we told Morrison. Found an abandoned church. Looked inside. Nothing but old furniture. We logged it and moved on." "They're going to ask details," Booker said. "How long we were inside, what we saw, who we talked to." "We didn't talk to anyone," Hayes said firmly, "because there was nobody there." Booker stared at him. "Sarge, Washington was in that church with us. He saw those men. He heard everything. Then we make sure he understands what's at stake, Hayes said. If this comes apart, we all go down, not just me. All three of us. Accessory after the fact. Aiding deserters. Lying in official reports. We'll spend the rest of the war in Leavenworth. Booker was quiet for a moment. Then he said, maybe that's what should happen. Hayes felt something twist in his chest. You having second thoughts? I don't know, Booker admitted. I've been thinking about those men. About what they did. About us letting them walk away. And I keep wondering if we made the right call. There was no right call, Hayes said. Just choices with different costs. Yeah, Booker said. But which cost can we live with? Hayes didn't have an answer for that. He'd been asking himself the same question every night since they left that church, so he just said, we stick to the story. That's the only way through this. Booker nodded reluctantly. I'll talk to Washington. Make sure he understands, Hayes said. Then he walked away, feeling Booker's eyes on his back. The next 6 days were the longest of Hayes's life. He went through the motions of duty, training his squad, filing reports, maintaining discipline. But inside, he was counting down to the moment the CID arrived and everything came apart. He thought about running, taking the dog tags and disappearing the same way those deserters had. But where would he go? He was a Negro sergeant in 1945 America. He couldn't just vanish into the wilderness. Every town, every checkpoint, every police officer would be a threat. On the 5th night, he sat alone in the barracks after lights out and took the dog tags from his footlocker. He spread them on his bunk, reading the names by moonlight coming through the window. 12 men, 12 lies, 12 families who'd buried the wrong bodies. He should turn them in, walk into Morrison's office and tell the truth. Accept the consequences. But that truth would destroy Booker and Washington too, and it would confirm every suspicion the Army had about Negro soldiers, that they couldn't be trusted, that they cut corners, that they protected the wrong people for the wrong reasons. Hayes gathered the tags and held them in his fist. Then he stood, walked to the latrine and dropped them down the sewage drain. He watched them disappear into darkness, heard the faint splash as they hit water somewhere below. Evidence gone, but the truth remained, carved into his memory like the names had been stamped into that metal. The CID arrived on a Tuesday morning. 2 investigators in pressed uniforms with captain's bars and expressions that gave nothing away, Captain Ross and Captain Weber. They set up in a conference room and began interviewing soldiers alphabetically. Hayes was called in on the 2nd day. He sat across from them at a metal table, his service record open between them. Ross did most of the talking. Weber took notes. Sergeant Hayes, Ross began, 3 weeks ago your squad conducted training exercises in the wilderness northwest of this base. Is that correct? Yes, sir. During that exercise you discovered a structure, an old church. Yes, sir. Walk me through what happened when you found it. Hayes recited the story he'd rehearsed. They'd seen the building through the trees, approached carefully, found the door unlocked, entered and found it empty except for old furniture. Saw signs someone had been there recently, logged it and moved on. Ross listened without expression. Did you search the building thoroughly? Yes, sir. Standard procedure. Did you find anything unusual? Supplies, equipment, personal effects? Just boot prints in the dust, Hayes said. Looked like hunters or drifters had used it as shelter. Weber spoke up for the first time. How many sets of boot prints? Hayes had anticipated this. Hard to say, sir. The floor was dirty. Could have been multiple people over time. But you didn't see anyone, Ross said. No, sir, and your men, Corporal Booker and Private Washington, they were with you inside the church. Yes, sir. And they saw the same thing you did. Nothing unusual. That's correct, sir. Ross leaned back in his chair. Sergeant, are you aware that 12 soldiers from the 28th Infantry Division are now officially listed as missing? Their bodies were supposedly buried in France. But those bodies are being exhumed, and none of them match the men they're supposed to be. Hayes kept his face neutral. I wasn't aware of that, sir. The timing is interesting, Ross continued. These men would have made it back to the States around the same time you found that church, and that church is in a remote area perfect for hiding. Hayes said nothing. He'd learned a long time ago that silence was safer than words. Weber looked at him. You understand what we're suggesting? You're suggesting those men were hiding in that church, Hayes said. But they weren't. The church was empty. "How can you be certain?" Ross asked. "Maybe they heard you coming and hid. Maybe they left right before you arrived." "If they had, we would have seen them," Hayes said. "We had the building surrounded." Ross pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. "This is Sergeant William Harding, one of the missing men. You ever seen him?" Hayes looked at the photo, at the face he'd stood 3 feet from in that church, at the scar over the eyebrow. "No, sir," he said, "never seen him." Ross studied Hayes for a long moment. Then he pulled the photo back. "All right, Sergeant. That's all for now. But if you remember anything else, anything at all, you report it immediately." "Yes, sir." Hayes was dismissed. He walked out of the conference room feeling like he'd just crossed a minefield. 2 down, Booker and Washington still to go. They interviewed Booker that afternoon. Hayes waited outside, watching through the window as the 2 captains asked their questions. Booker's face remained calm, his answers measured. He told the same story Hayes had. Empty church, nobody home. When he came out, he gave Hayes a small nod. Clean. Washington was interviewed the next morning. Hayes watched him go in, saw the tension in his shoulders. Washington was younger, less experienced with interrogations. If anyone broke, it would be him. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. Hayes paced outside, his mind running through worst-case scenarios. Finally, the door opened, and Washington emerged. His face was pale, but steady. He looked at Hayes and nodded once before walking away. Hayes let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The CID spent another 3 days on the base, interviewing other soldiers, checking records, searching for leads. But they found nothing. No evidence, no witnesses. No proof that 12 deserters had ever been anywhere near Kentucky. On their last day, Captain Ross stopped Hayes in the company area. "We're closing the investigation here," he said, "but this isn't over. Those men are out there somewhere, and eventually they'll surface. When they do, we'll find out who helped them." "I hope you do, sir," Hayes said. Ross held his eyes for a moment, then nodded and walked away. That night, Hayes sat on his bunk and realized that he'd gotten away with it. He'd lied to military investigators. He'd protected deserters. He'd buried evidence, and he'd walked away clean. But the weight of it didn't lift. If anything, it settled deeper. 2 weeks later, the war in Europe ended. Germany surrendered. Soldiers celebrated in the streets. But Hayes felt nothing. He'd spent 5 years preparing to fight, and the closest he'd come to combat was finding 12 men who'd run from it. The 92nd Division began preparing for possible deployment to the Pacific. But in August, Japan surrendered too. The war was over, one without Hayes ever firing a shot at an enemy. Soldiers began rotating home. Units disbanded. The vast machinery of war started winding down. Hayes received his discharge papers in October. Honorable service, commendations, a record that showed nothing but duty and discipline. He packed his duffel bag and prepared to leave. On his last night on base, Booker found him outside the barracks. "You ever think about them?" Booker asked. "Those men in the church." "Every day," Hayes said. "You think they're still out there?" "Probably, living under different names, working regular jobs, pretending the war never happened." Booker was quiet for a moment. "You think we did the right thing?" Hayes looked at him. "I think we did the only thing we could live with. Whether it was right, I don't know. Maybe there's no right answer when both choices cost you something." Booker nodded slowly. "I can live with what we did," he said. "I just wish it didn't feel like we betrayed everyone who didn't run." "That's the price," Hayes said. "We carry it now, same as they do." They shook hands. Booker left for Chicago the next morning. Washington had already gone home to Virginia, and Hayes got on a bus heading south back to Alabama. Back to a civilian life he wasn't sure he remembered how to live. He carried his duffel bag and his discharge papers and the memory of 12 men who'd chosen survival over honor. And he carried the knowledge that he'd done the same thing, just in a different way. Years later, when people asked him about the war, he'd tell them about the training, the discipline, the men he'd served with. He never mentioned the church, never spoke about the choice he'd made in that cold February morning, but sometimes late at night, he'd think about those dog tags disappearing down the drain, about 12 names that belonged to the wrong bodies, about the moment he'd decided that justice mattered less than survival, and he'd wonder if those deserters ever thought about him. If they ever wondered whether the Negro sergeant who'd let them walk away had paid a price for his mercy. He had. He was still paying it, and he would carry that weight until the day they put him in the ground. Because some choices don't end when you make them. They echo forward, shaping everything that comes after, reminding you that honor isn't always about doing what's right. Sometimes it's about choosing which wrong you can live with, and living with it every single day for the rest of your life.